we have the questing ace, who references something that I did quite a long time ago, which was to contribute to this Isaris Incorporated / Steve Jackson Games publication, which was in the late stage of the existence of the game that had come to be called HeroQuest. So Hero Wars, HeroQuest, and then the publications were basically being aided. Isaris Incorporated was being aided by Steve Jackson Games and actually putting them out physically. And it is, for lack of a better word, embedded in a meta plot. So they needed chapters or slots or scenarios in their sort of big framework of a bunch of books, and this one was called Sartar Rising. So there were several different books along in Sartar Rising, and this is one of them. So the notion of who the player characters are in a general sense and what they're up to and what we're playing for is all locked down across all of this. Talk about being hit with a 90s stick. And actually I found it kind of repugnant. I didn't really want to didn't want to be thinking about Glorantha that way. So many times I have encountered people who say, yes, your Glorantha may vary, your Glorantha will vary. And then you look at what they do in the publications, and it is absolutely counter to that. It is, this is what it is, and you do that if you want to do it right. I don't know why, but that happens. Especially, in the mid 2000s, you'd think people would not be stuck in that, but here we are in 2022, and many of the games I've recently played are hideously stuck in that. So what can you do? All right, so this was volume 3 of Sartar Rising. Anyway, to get to the point, the questing ace asks me, I was reading the final days at Skull Point. One thing that stood out to me was how it felt a little like a prepped venture for Circle of Hands. If you had the opportunity to redo the final days at Skull Point, would you take the same approach as what is written here and use a more familiar scenario format, or try something different? The logic of the question is a little bit throwing me because it's kind of hard to tell whether a prepped venture for Circle of Hands is what he's calling the same approach, more familiar approach, or whether he's thinking of it as different. So I'm not quite going to try to pull that apart. And what I'll talk to you about is a bit about how this was written and why. So first of all, you should know that it is a Highlands clan scenario, drawing heavily on Norse sagas. So all this is long before, various PBTA stuff about these things and stuff like that. I had played a lot of Hero Wars, and a lot of this was taken from our game. So a lot of the material was used in play and had run into different things, and has a fairly complex historical, sort of a very complex historical backstory of through several generations and things like that. There's some unknown incest in there. Two people are about to be married, and if they get married, then there's going to be a huge metaphysical effect on the clan's spiritual entity, and then there's terrifying creatures who are going to exploit this situation. But anyway, the basic idea is that they don't in our game, this was actually the character's own clan, and it was their own generational history, their own backstory. They weren't those two characters who were about to get married. Those were NPCs, but they were people that they knew. Here, it's fundamental to this whole supplemental supplement series that your characters are a little band who travels about and goes from here and goes to there and goes to here and goes to there. And so each of these chapters is a place to go. So a great deal of the write-up here concerns strangers coming to this place called Skull Point. And then there's a section about fitting into the community. Now, I make a point. I remember insisting that if this were to be the case, that the people playing, the characters being played, are going to be living there, and they would never be involved in the affairs of the clan of this way unless they had been kind of accepted into the place and were living there for a while. So it wasn't like show up and stand in front of the guy sitting on the big chair and like making a case for, and then saying, oh, I'm trying to learn what's going on around here or some shit like that. So this all prefigures a lot of what I did later in Circle of Hands, thinking about this somewhat artificial construct of all these extremely local communities where people really don't travel very much. And then having characters go there and encounter them. At this point, when this came out, just finding the little indicia here, 2004. This actually precedes Dogs in the Vineyard. And you can kind of see that I was already kind of down on the idea of travelers showing up to solve a problem without actually feeling themselves to be part of that community, even as visitors, and vice versa, the community feeling as though they are there. So it's a difficult thing. You're doing a community-based situation, but the characters aren't part of it. Well, as it turned out, a big part much later, a decade later, writing Circle of Hands, was to take that as a given and then say, all right, let's make this functional. Let's make this, let's talk about how people are part of a community or come to be part of a community, especially in low tech, where you don't just show up at a place and leave the next day. If you show up at a place, people knew you were coming. And you're going to be living there a long time, like a season or a year. You might even just stay. This really didn't match. I mean, this was the text that they put in, all about showing up and the message that you bring from, the person who's sending you off on all these missions and stuff, and all that stuff is really tacked on. You can probably see if you were to read this. I fancy that you could see what was not my text. Yes, if the heroes ask why a clan so far away concerns the rebellion, Orngarin will explain. Aye, yes, bean't no one can scout in the hills like them skull pointers. They could sneak the tail offen a Telmorian, hop up a mountain like it was your father's stool. We hear the Lunars are building something big, something dangerous, off in the northeast of the Stormwalks, and they've shut that up tighter than Harst's safe box. She says we need to know what's in there, and for that we need the best. So they wrote this little speech for some NPC to, in vernacular, so they think, to, inform the inquisitive player as to why we have to go do this. This is stuff that doesn't. This is stuff that just doesn't work for me. It doesn't work for the scenario. It's very much taking something about the place you live and then making you a visitor in it, and it is difficult. The same thing occurred in terms of the events, because I really wanted to get across the idea that this was not a programmed scenario. There are several different instabilities, some rather straightforward and not all that stressful, some of them very stressful, that can proceed. The rate at which they proceed isn't in lockstep. Whether certain next steps in each one occur isn't guaranteed. This was hugely difficult for the editors when I kept trying to explain this, and they really didn't know how to present it. So the text of the write-up struggles horribly with then this happens versus, well, this stuff is going on, after a session, take it from there. See where you get, and whatever blows up or doesn't blow up, or I don't know. The idea that you could play a scenario and not use half of what's written in there is very difficult for a lot of people. Okay, so after all this complaining in context, what I'm really saying is this. The whole question of if you had the opportunity to redo the final days at Skull Point, well, hold on. I did it in play. The redo is what I did here, adapting it into the purposes of these particular editors and the development of this line of supplements. So I wouldn't redo this. I already have the first do, the actual do, which is this is about a community that the characters belong to. So hopefully that answers the question. It raises other questions about Circle of Hands, in which you are people who are coming to a community, a very well-established one, who are not, born there or married into it or something like that. And that has its own issues. And the answer to that is I'm handling it very differently from what you see here. For one thing, you're not on missions. For another, the whole idea of integrating into the community as such, that actually ties into another person's questions. So I'll deal with that in a bit. Okay, so hopefully that answers the question. Perhaps over to answers, but there you are. Oh, and here we go. Next person. It's from Jesse. It has to do with Circle of Hands and this rule. Circle Knight or not, you're usually on their turf, and going straight up to them and using an attribute against them will only employ a single die. You can get the full two dice if you do something appropriate to social rank or indisputably effective first, or after you manage to make a penalized blah, 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 blah. So Jesse says he gets the why of this rule. What I have trouble imaging is how to identify the transition point of you're operating with one die. Okay, now you're operating with two. I'm used to starting scenes hot in the middle of a crisis. So as you walk into town, you see a 15-year-old girl tied to a pole with hay stacked up around her. The villagers have lit torches and are chanting, burn the witch, what do you do? But it feels like Circle of Hands is meant to ease into things a bit more, and there's kind of an acclimate to the community part of play. And I'm just having trouble envisioning how that works. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that, especially as it relates to the operating at one die versus now operating at two dice rule. The solution is actually quite clear, and it's actually embedded in the question. It doesn't happen inside a scene. Transitioning from one die to two dice in terms of getting anything done in this community is not a matter of shifting inside a scene of play. Instead, and this is something that anyone GMing Circle of Hands either goes, oh, and just does it and say, oh, this is different, or they just run into it and they're like, because again, they're used to the players showing up, the characters showing up, and people saying, okay, nobody knows who we are, nobody knows who we're here, we've shown up, what do we see? And what do you do? Instead, again, low-tech communities. Geographically appropriate, I guess is the best way to put it. It's in the book. I can't go into it here. But the idea is that as the Circle Knights have traveled across the landscape to get to this place, they have met people. And in many cases, those people become kind of a support staff for a little while. So imagine, a couple of days travel, somebody's hunting for you. Somebody is, putting you up. They meet you, they travel on ahead of you, and the next, that evening, They tell you, hey, stop by my hut, my grandmother's hut, or, my chief's place, and they'll stay the night there. And then a couple of days further, none of these people are continuing with you. They've been kind of replaced by more people that you've met along the way. And as this continues, people are going on ahead. Some of them are traveling onto that place on their own, perhaps, or they are from that place and you're within the range of where they operate as a hunter or whatever. And so you meet them. And sure enough, by the time you get there, the different social communities that the characters belong to, basically 4, are aware of you. So you have a place to stay. You will, if you are, one of the professionals, that's your social rank, people who either need that kind of service or who already provide a related one here, they have a place for you to stay. They know your name. They take you in. And so the idea that you show up like as if you were beamed there from the Enterprise and are looking around to see what you see. And who's that guy? I follow that guy. Stuff like that just doesn't apply. And so what you do is basically say, as the GM, Jesse, what you say is, what are you going to do in that group of families and communities and living spaces? This is the kind of place you'll be sleeping in. This is what seems to be going on among these people. If it has to do with food, what they're eating and how it's prepared or distributed. If it has to do with what I call the gentry, which is pretty ungentle in Circle of Hands. Where do they keep their horses, and what kind of place are you sleeping in? What kind of people, what sort of things do they do in the morning? And you're telling them that, and you say, okay, tell me a little bit about what you're doing. All they have to do is say, oh yeah, I throw in, these guys do a lot of, this is the season where they're doing a whole lot of making charcoal, like, bring great big, wagons full of charcoal into the community. So that means they're out there all day long, chopping wood and burning it in these low fires to make all this charcoal. So I'm out there, I'm hacking away. Or if it's a fishing community, it's like, okay, I'm out there in a boat, I'm hauling in the nets with the other fishermen and stuff like that. Okay, 2 dice on stuff. Now, it's when circumstances throw you into part of the community that you're not familiar with, or if, God help you, you do that kind of stupid Black Ops thing where your character skulks around and acts funny. You're just like, if you're going to play your character as a psycho, they're going to treat you as a psycho, and you're just not going to succeed at shit, hardly at all. Can't help you. Is it a punishment mechanic? To some extent, but it's also extremely naturalistic. Go in, act funny, don't do things that are part of the community that you are eminently expected to do non-problematically, and that are basically the only things you're good at anyway. Then I can't help you. This setting is unforgiving in that regard. So there is no hoop to jump through. There is no critical role or critical action you have to do inside a scene that you're under pressure to do. This is basically supposed to be non-problematic and just the essence of play. In practice, people who don't make it a problem discover that it's not a problem. So with again, don't start a scene is the answer for you. You're talking about the situational, non-scene context that scenes will be in. You need to know how the players are interacting about that. And never mind if they start babbling, well, I'm going to start investigating. Shut up. We know. We'll get there in a scene in a bit. Right now, we're just talking about how you're living there. Because this is the long term, my friends. You're going to be there for 2 weeks before you do a fucking thing. You just are.